The organization, the International Transport Forum at the OECD, is an intergovernmental forum that brings together 57 transport ministries from around the world. Norway is a member. In fact, 2 years ago, Norway had the presidency of the International Transport Forum. And we work with our member governments, with our transport ministers and their staff to help make everyday mobility better for you, for us, for society. And so I've been asked today by FutureBuilt to give a global perspective on car-free cities and to speak broadly about the future of urban mobility. And I'm not going to speak exhaustively with all that in mind. I will try to bear a focus on three particular things. We will hear later from two cities that are actively working on making a car light and car-free zones in their cities very much a reality, both Brussels and Strasbourg. But today I'll speak to three things that are important to characterize the challenges that we have to overcome for transport to continue to drive prosperity and to do so sustainably in our cities. And I'll talk first about the urban and the human. I'll then talk about the notion of car-free cities, and I'll finally conclude talking a bit about convergence and disruption in our cities and how that will impact the ways in which we look forward to decreasing the role of cars in cities. Now, I will start first with the urban and the human and the role that this idea of the linkage between people and cities must play in our transport planning. Cities are hugely popular. We heard this earlier today, covering less than 5% of the Earth's landmass, concentrating more than 50% of the population in the world, 80% in many developed countries like in Norway, 70% of wealth production, and an almost equal share of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, cities concentrate both access and opportunity, but it's also equally important to remember that 30% of the world's urban areas are comprised of low income and poor access informal dwellings. People crowd into cities because for both the rich and for the poor, cities are formidable economic accelerants that build on the ease of access to labor and jobs and to ideas and creativity. And equitable access is important. As the urbanist and author Jane Jacobs said, cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. Now, cities are also spaces, and when we take away the buildings, when we take away those spaces that are not allocated to transport, we're left with a lattice that is dominated by the room we give for mobility and movement. And though these are important functions in our cities, they are not the only function of the space between the buildings. And the cities that we get when we only focus on how well that space moves vehicles are rather inhospitable places for humans. And this is unfortunate because the strength of our cities, the strength of our society rests upon the people that are at the heart of both. We can and should ask ourselves some fundamental questions regarding how well we account for, invite, and include people in planning for our cities. At what speed do we interact with the city? In what conditions might we like to interact with our cities? Do we invite the most vulnerable amongst us to explore safely and autonomously in our urban spaces? And what can we say about the quality of public space? Does it invite people? Does it invite us to meet, to pause, and to sit? And when we do sit, what happens? Do we talk? Do we play? Do we invent new uses, essential uses for our shared common living space? Do we enable our cities to fulfill their promise as catalysts for culture and economic activity, or do we allow these benefits to erode either by design or, worse yet, by accident? These are essential questions. And let me say a few words about the cities of the 21st century and of the trips that we'll make there. Not only will 94% of all new trips in the world take place in developing countries, every single one of these new trips will take place in an urban setting. And these trips will accompany population growth. Looking to the recent past and to the near-term future, we can see that the 21st century will be the Asian, African, and Latin American century. And this growth will pose formidable challenges, as we can expect this growth to lead to the expansion of urban regions in ways that will challenge urban governance, like here in the Yangtze River Valley Delta, of China around Shanghai. Growth that will be accompanied by significant and sometimes crippling levels of congestion if we do not become more creative at handling the access and mobility conundrum in our cities, and especially in cities that can provide a model for the rest of the world. We have to address this in places like the streets of Jakarta, like, unfortunately, my own experience in the Paris metro system, or even on the bicycle tracks of the Netherlands and of Copenhagen. What we need to remind ourselves is that in the cities and towns of the 21st century, one single mode of transport will not be able to fulfill our needs for access and mobility. We will need cars. More efficient, smaller, safer, certainly, and fewer, no doubt. We will need high-quality public transport and well-connected public transport. We will need to redesign or reconfigure our cities to better support walking and cycling. And so here, let me talk about the role that car-free cities can play in delivering improved and more balanced access options to people in our urban areas. And what I would like to stress here is that to focus on car-free cities as an end unto itself perhaps misses the point. Cars are simply objects, and cities without cars are simply cities without these objects on their streets. That is not a vision. That is a description. No, a vision is a city that is carefree when it comes to mobility and access. A vision is a city that is more scaled to its inhabitants than to its vehicles. A vision is a city where people can hear each other speak, where they do not feel threatened by traffic, and have space to meet, to sit, to interact, and to create. All the things that cities have historically provided. Now, we should be mindful of the space that we have given to cars in our cities, and we should look for opportunities to rebalance our streets and plazas to uses that improve the city, not take away from our cities. A carefree city will certainly be car-light, and it will be comprised of some zones with much fewer cars and many zones that might be car-free. But a carefree city should not be only about, nor should it focus exclusively on removing cars. And this is because delivering livable cities is a complex endeavor. But a good starting point is to make it as easy to live in our cities without a car as with a car. And I'll take Paris as an example, a city where most people, in the center at least, walk to get around. There's an extensive and relatively well-performing rail-based public transport system that serves to bring people into and move around the city. There is a far-ranging bus service that increases regional connectivity at a cost. The popular Philippe bicycle share system is ubiquitous in the city center and is the largest bike share network in the world outside of China, where it is dwarfed by many, many much larger systems. There are now over 2,000 electric station-based Autolib cars that give Parisians an option somewhere between a taxi and a private car. And of course, there are both taxis and transportation network companies like Uber providing further mobility options to inhabitants. These systems represent a considerable investment. They are very popular and resulted in a 25% decrease in vehicle kilometers traveled within the Paris city center. But the city is changing. The city center has lost more than 5% of its population. Activities are increasingly shifting to the periphery, and this is not unique to Paris. Most of the growth in the region is taking place out in the periphery, in regions like towns like these, and in low-density residential developments like these, where public transport, walking, and cycling are often poorly integrated into transport networks, if they are integrated at all. And as a result, car traffic is increasing in the suburbs and around Paris, leading to repeated and severe air quality alerts in the capital. When we think about the carefree and car-light city, we should not forget to look to the periphery, because this is where it may be most difficult to live without the kind of access that cars provide. But Paris has a lesson to provide as well on how to help the transition away from cars in its center. A city center that in the 1970s saw 2 urban motorways built along the Seine River, thus cutting off one of the city's most valuable assets from its citizens. Now, starting in 2002, the newly elected mayor of the city decided to temporarily convert during the summer the left bank motorway into a beach during the summer months, Paris Plage, to allow inhabitants to have a vacation spot in the city, but also to start a long process to reclaim the banks of the Seine from cars. Paris Plage proved to be hugely popular, but it also gave inhabitants a feel for what this part of the city could feel like without cars. And because its impacts were monitored, it gave the city the confidence to look at permanently converting the urban motorways into car-free zones, starting with the left bank motorway. This busy motorway was permanently closed to vehicles in 2013 and was converted into a very popular urban esplanade, reserved only for pedestrians and cyclists. Parisians once again enjoyed easy access to the river, and this both facilitated and generated new cultural and recreational activities that have since enhanced the livability of the city. And crucially, not only were citizens starting to get a real feel for what a car-free river would look like, they were starting to be able to imagine a car-free city. Now, the city, further bolstered by the data they'd gathered on the traffic impacts of these closures, have now decided to permanently convert the Right Bank Expressway into a traffic-calmed urban avenue that will be completely car-free by 2018. And the plan is now to look elsewhere in the city to see where more space can be given back to citizens, including here on the iconic Champs-Élysées. The current mayor has announced plans to ban all cars eventually from the city center, starting next year with the oldest and most polluting vehicles, as have many other cities in Europe. And to help citizens understand what that would feel like, the city has leveraged the use of car-free days like this one last fall so that citizens can get first-hand experience with what a more balanced, car-free city feels like. And this perhaps is Paris's lesson. We don't know really what a car-free city feels or looks like, because none of us in our generation and the generation before and the generation that's coming after us will have lived in a car-free city. Our cities have been dominated by the car. And so there will be considerable reticence to move away from this model, providing temporary, safe, and sometimes temporary new opportunities for citizens to get a feel for, to get a visceral sense of how a car-like city sounds, of how it looks, what it smells like, what it feels like, is an important first step in moving towards a car-free city center. Now, finally, I'd like to close by saying a few words about how we must be prepared for both convergence and disruption, as this will have an impact on how our cities may function in the future. Cities have always been changing and have always been adapting both to internal and external forces. That is, in fact, their strength. But perhaps one of the most transformational changes we have seen in cities and in society recently is the sharp rise in data that we produce, that we gather, and that we analyze about our environment and about our behavior. And this surge in data production and use has largely been driven by ubiquitous sensing and computing devices, devices that did not exist 10 years ago, but that have become indispensable to many and soon most urban inhabitants. The emergence of smartphone and other sensed data is only one part of the ensemble of new services and technologies that are co-developing in our cities and on our roads. We have the tendency to look at each of these in isolation, but the fact is that everything in the 21st century technology kit is changing at the same time and leading to new possibilities, both good and bad, that we can hardly grasp at present. And what we can clearly see is a tendency for the convergence of technologies, transport modes, and use cases on an unparalleled scale, leading to changes analogous to what changed with the cheap production of electricity. This convergence involves new mobility services that allow for seamless car-like transport without requiring the purchase of a car. It also involves legacy services applying the same tools to increase mobility options for citizens. It is the result of a generation of global digital natives that are increasingly more willing to interact with app-based public transport-like services, like the real-time optimized pop-up bus services operated by Bridge here in the United States, than with traditional forms of public transport. And I'm going to open a parenthesis in my talk here to see how many of you already feel that you're part of this generation, because it's not really a question of age. And I'll start with this picture here. Now, I found that I've had to ask now how many people know what this is. So I assume, can I see a show of hands? How many people know what this is? Okay. Now, I'm going to ask how many of you, let's say in the last year, have experienced this? Okay. Were you stressed out by this? Yes? No? A little bit? A little bit. How many of you have experienced this in the last month? How many of you were stressed out by this? Okay, so I see that you're already in this digital millennial generation. And this literally freaks my kids out because it represents a loss of contact, of access, in many cases of mobility. So the convergence of which I spoke to also involves self-driving vehicles in the mix, and particularly new mobility services that may be based on fleets of self-driving cars. Uber is actively working on this. We've just had discussions with them on what some of their business plans will be. Same for Google. They're doing this. They have a very interesting business plan looking forward at fleets of self-driving vehicles. GM and Lyft have made a public announcement announcing a global partnership to deploy a ride-sharing fleet of self-driving cars, and many other manufacturers are hedging their bets by investing both car sharing services and self-driving technology. And this, quite frankly, would be a sensible thing to do, since in the cities of the 21st century, a business plan by manufacturers predicated on selling a car to everyone that can afford one is not viable, given the extreme space constraints and poor use of valuable real estate that this would entail. And that is because the car itself is a spectacularly underused asset. Most cars today are used for less than 15 minutes a day. And that we put up with such inefficiency reveals just how much we value the convenience that cars provide for those that own cars. Now, we at the International Transport Forum have looked into how the data, transport service, self-driving convergence might manifest itself and what might be some of its impacts. And a key question we sought to answer was, are there scenarios where a new kind of car use is in fact good for the city and not bad as it has been at the volume of which we've experienced it in the past? And our focus was on what optimized car sharing with or without self-driving technology as both a hybrid and evolving form of personal and public form of transport could entail for our cities. And what we found is that by combining a real-time optimized shared taxi, self-driving or not, by a real-time optimized on-demand minibus network, and traditional high-capacity public transport systems, a city could replace every single car and bus trip with the same level of service quality as today, but with only 3% of the vehicles that are currently on the fleet. That is that more than 9 out of 10 vehicles could theoretically, important to note that, theoretically, be removed from our streets with little loss in service quality. Now that is a significant effect, but one that's consistent with many other studies. Now, these systems would have significant impacts on the parking needs and allocation of public space in the city. In all of the scenarios that we studied, we found that on-street parking could be completely removed, leading to a release of 20% of the curb-to-curb space in the city. We also started thinking about, well, what does a city without these parking needs look like? And well, one of the things we see is that there are many new possibilities that we cannot envisage now in our cities that become quite possible. And one of those is the reallocation of the space that we give to four-wheeled boxes on our city streets back to humans who occupy those boxes quite inefficiently. This is in Philadelphia, but we see the reclaiming of space as being one of the key things that could happen with the arrival of these technologies, but only if we make sure that happens. We can also imagine a city where we allocate much more room now than we do to both walking and to cycling. And that's important because these are still going to be essential modes in our 21st century cities, because these are the healthy ways in which we can get around. We can also think of new ways of delivering services to our cities because of this release of space. But all these things have to be anticipated both by policymaking and in the plans that we make for our cities going forward. 80% of the off-street parking space we saw could also be removed, and that releases a tremendous amount of potential space for new uses, office buildings, but also redistribution centers for goods. When we looked at this system, we could see that you could reduce the amount of car kilometers traveled. That means that we can take away some of the congestion impacts that we see now, and at the same time, we can reduce the amount of CO2 and energy use in the system. These are very heady findings, if you will, and these represent a potential, and I have to stress a potential. But this also shows the way in which we have to make decisions now to harness these technologies, to harness these developments so that they support a car-light city, so that they support a city for humans, so that they support what citizens in their cities want. We also looked at access, and what we found surprisingly is that looking, for example, here for every 200-meter cell in this city, this is Lisbon, we looked at what percentage of jobs could be reached within that 30-minute period. And here we see today, with the public transport corridors, a high level of access along the metro system that drops off precipitously for the rest of the city, for those using public transport. But with the kind of system that I've just described, we see an increase in the amount of access given to citizens in the city. We also look at education and healthcare facilities. But with car-like access, without the car impacts. So I say this because when we think about the future, we have to think about how cars and the use of this technology might change as well. A car-light city, a city with a different type of car, a city with a new relationship to the way in which it gets around for public transport, because what I've described could be very well a new form of public transport, is something that we have to anticipate. But the main thing we have to keep in mind is that the goal is a city that allows people to actualize themselves, cities that allow people to become better in what they are, cities that allow contacts and the creation of innovation, the creation of culture, the creation of economic activity to emerge. And we have not done a very good job of that in the 20th century. We can do much better. And I'll close with these words from Brent Todarian. And what he points out is that when we think about looking at a city only through the prism of car mobility, then that city fails everyone, including those that use cars. But when we think about a city where we take into account humans as the heart, then everyone benefits. Car-light city, car-free city, everyone benefits, including those people who still use cars. And I think that the discussion, the dialogue that FutureBuilt has started here is one of the important first steps going forward to what the 21st century, an attractive, modern, livable 21st century can look like. And that city will have car-free zones, but it will also be car-light throughout it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philippe. We've got a few questions for you.
Okay.
Even with sharing cars and other types of new transport and technology, there will always be an issue that everyone needs the cars, buses, etc. at the same time. Are getting rid of traditional rush hours and working patterns a part of the future city?
Well, I mean, when I said that everything is changing, everything is changing. And so one of the things that we can imagine changing is also the need to access work as we have in the 20th century. Now we have been told, like with the paperless office, that we are going to access our work differently going forward. And we don't see a tremendous amount of evidence that we're moving that way. But it's conceivable that people will not necessarily need to access jobs at certain periods during the day, especially when we think about service jobs. When we look at where the service economy has changed the most, away from a 9-to-5 type job and more into a gig type, where you work on a project and you work onto another project, then the need to actually access the city center or hubs in the city at peak hours is reduced. But the system that I've described when we ran the modeling, and again, this is only a theoretical model, but when we looked at this, we didn't have any peak hour effects because the efficiency of the system is so much greater.
One more question for you. How does the car industry react to this efforts to make more car-free or car-light cities?
A key question is who is the car industry of the 21st century? Is it Volvo? Is it GM? Is it Google? Is it Apple? I suspect that in the next 10 years, people will be accessing cars, not buying cars, accessing cars that are put onto the market by companies that we never imagined would be making cars. First off, Google, perhaps Apple, perhaps even Uber, Tesla. And so the car industry will change. Those that are still manufacturing vehicles will also have to change their product offer, especially in OECD high developed countries, because the demand for cars is leveling and dropping off. The demand for driving is leveling and dropping off. And the cost, the way in which people pay for cars becomes much more interesting when you can start paying per kilometer. And when a car manufacturer sells kilometers of use rather than a block of car, then they too become a very different company.
I guess maybe the driving force for this change for more car-light cities is a combination of the technological possibilities and young people.
It's one more thing too, and that's especially important for cities like Oslo. All that I've presented here requires anticipation on the part of political decision makers, because what I've presented here is accompanied by a regulatory framework that makes it possible. Right now, let's say a city like Oslo wanted to provide this kind of quasi-public transport based on shared vehicles. Well, many public transport operators cannot do that because of the laws that regulate public transport operation. So the state and the city will have to think about how do we adapt our laws to nudge us in one direction versus another direction. So there's a key role in looking at the regulatory framework that we have developed today, a framework that is developed for the last century, and see where we can adapt it for the kind of city we want for the 21st century. So it's not just young people, it's not just the manufacturers, it is the public decision makers that have to open the gate in one way and maybe close the gate in another way. And I think that's what Oslo is doing.
Yeah, that was a nice final comment. Thank you very much,
You're
Philippe.
welcome. Thank you.